Welcome to the IMA Weekly Show. I'm Dr. Mollie James, Senior Fellow with the Independent Medical Alliance and founder of the James Clinic. Tonight, we have some special guests for you and a very exciting topic that all of you can apply to your own health. We talk a lot about heart health and cardiovascular health, and most of us think about things like cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood sugar. I'm going to ask quickly, how many of you have heard of the Glycocalyx? I'm guessing many of you haven't. You can drop that in the chat. So we are going to talk tonight about some numbers and parameters that actually tell more of a full picture about your cardiovascular health than you could even imagine. I want to welcome our two guests. First of all is Robert Bob Long. He's the CEO and co-founder of Genesis Health Sciences and president of the Glycocalyx Research Institute. He has spent more than a decade advancing the clinical application of endothelial glycocalyx research, helping translate microvascular science into practical tools for cardiovascular risk assessment. Under his leadership, the GlycoCheck system has now been used in more than 150 peer-reviewed studies worldwide. Our second guest is Dr. Hans Vink. He's the Chief Scientific Officer of the Glycocalyx Institute. His work focuses on developing clinically applicable tools for early detection of cardiovascular risk and promoting vascular wall integrity. He has published more than 100 scientific papers and is internationally recognized for advancing the field of microvascular medicine. So let's start tonight with the bigger picture. When we talk about know your numbers, what is the parameter? What should we actually be looking at if we want to start to evaluate the health of our cardiovascular system? Who's going to take that first?
Oh, you're asking us? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah, that's you guys.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Hans, if you want to start.
Well, you probably all know your classical risk factors that everybody asks you, your cholesterol levels, your blood pressure, your age, your gender, family history. That's all well known. The only problem with all those risk factors is it's very general and it's very limited in predicting risk per individual. So I'm just going to mention one study that we did is in 600 healthy individuals that we all screened for the classical risk factors and then did a 6-year follow-up. And turns out that, of all the people that got a heart attack or a stroke, 40% of those people could not be identified by the classical risk factors. So they had a low risk profile and that didn't help them to predict their risk. So that's where studies that we are doing come in with looking at the glycocalyx, see if your glycocalyx is healthy, but I guess we'll get to that a little bit later.
Yeah. And Bob, I've heard the story that you've told before. This actually started as a personal issue for you with your own health, right? Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's what actually got me on this path over 20 years ago. I was actually an executive in an entirely different industry. I was traveling all over the world setting up our sales and distribution models. And so I drove myself pretty hard. And I live in Utah in a little town called Alpine, right up against the mountains. And when I'd go hiking out in my yard or up on the mountains, I'd get this angina in my chest. And so I went to my personal physician who just lived down the street for my exam. And he said, "Oh, you've probably got a blockage." And I said, "Well, that's not good." And so he immediately called the cardiologist and sent me down to the regional medical facility. I didn't realize I was going to the cath lab, but that's where I went. And they were doing procedures that day. And so they came in, they evaluated me. They said, well, you haven't had a heart attack. We don't really know why you have that angina, but what it probably is just a blockage. So the surest way to know, this is over 20 years ago, they said, we can go in with a little camera in your groin, go up in, and we can see if you've got a blockage. And if you've got a blockage, we put a stent in and that'll solve the problem. I said, well, that's not what I planned on today, but let's go ahead. So we did it. And at the end of the procedure, I was the last person that night because I wasn't an emergency. And the cardiologist came in and said, I got good news and I've got bad news. And I said, well, what's the good news? And he goes, well, you didn't have any blockages. And I go, well, what's the bad news? And this is what he said. It kind of shocked me. He said, we don't really know what's wrong with you. And I said, well, that's kind of weird. And so he proceeded to write out a bunch of prescriptions. I went home, and the more I thought about it, I probably had a weird reaction compared to most people. The more I thought about it, it made me mad. And it didn't make me mad at the cardiologist. What it made me mad about was that was the best medical treatment and medical science had to offer when I went in. And I got thinking, gosh, if this is happening to me, this has got to be happening to millions of other people around the world. So that's what started me on this whole path. And so by accident, I one day I was talking with a friend, and he said, have you ever heard of the Glycocalyx? And I said, what? I couldn't even say it. It's kind of a complicated word. And then if you add endothelial glycocalyx to it, which is, it even becomes more complicated. So that's what started me on this quest, was that personal scare I had for myself.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot of people watching right now that can relate to that, or somebody in their family has had that. I know I see a lot of patients that go in with weird symptoms. I'll just call them weird symptoms, that come out with a statin, even though their cholesterol is fine, because nobody knows what to do with them. So what you guys bring to the table really gives another dimension to evaluating cardiovascular health. So Dr. Vink, can you help us start with the foundation? What are we actually talking about, and kind of share with us what this looks like and what does it mean?
Sure, and if it's okay with you, I'll show you a few slides to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So I always start with this picture to make sure we have the same understanding of the cardiovascular system. And most people know the typical picture on the left, that we have a heart. The heart pumps blood into large arteries. The arteries take the blood to the different organs like your kidney, your brain, your muscle, your heart, and then we have large veins taking the blood back to the heart. What not everybody realizes what happens with the blood when it enters the organs. So if you take a microscope and it's zooming in and look at smaller details, you get the picture on the right-hand side. It shows that all over your body, in every organ, close to every cell in any organ, are these tiny, tiny capillaries that are very small blood vessels. They're so small, you need a microscope to actually see them. They're so small, actually, that red blood cells need to flow through them one by one. They need to be squeezed inside these little tubes. So when I started working in this field and started making live videos of how blood flows through those small capillaries, you got videos like this. This is one individual capillary with a big microscope. So this has a diameter of about 5 microns. And these little black dots you see flowing here through the tube are individual red blood cells. Well, what surprised me when I started looking at this is that these blood cells, they have to be squeezed into this tube. So they're 7 microns in diameter, undeformed. The tube is 5, so they need to be squeezed in. But once they're inside, you would expect them scraping along the wall because they don't fit. Well, actually, there's a big gap between where the red blood cells are flowing in the center. And you see the black lines on either side is the wall of this capillary blood vessel. And there's this big space between the center where the red cells are flowing and the actual position of the capillary wall. Well, in terms of blood volume, it's even worse because now that goes by the square of the diameter. So this is a 5 micron tube. So the total anatomical volume would be 25. But the actual diameter where the blood is flowing is only about 3 microns in diameter. So only 9 out of 25 is blood perfused, which means 16 out of 25 of the volume. So more than 2/3 of the total volume inside those tiny vessels is actually filled with whatever is in that space between the red cells and the wall. So a few years later, we were able to take better pictures of what's actually happening inside that space between the red cells and the surface of the blood vessel wall. And we got these kinds of pictures. So again, this is a cross section, one of those capillary blood vessels. So this is in heart muscle. And you realize all these bush-like structures on the inside of the vessel. And on the right-hand side is a higher magnification. So on top would be where red blood cell flowing. This is the endothelium that makes up the inner lining of blood vessel walls. And the endothelium itself is very thin. In these small vessels, it's about 1/10 or 2/10 of a micron. And on top of the endothelium, as part of what the endothelium produces, you see all these bush-like structures sticking out into the lumen of the blood vessels. These are polysaccharides, long sugar molecules like heparin, heparin sulfate, hyaluronic acid, and they are produced by the endothelium, bound to the membrane, and growing into the blood lumen space and preventing blood cells from touching the wall. And you can appreciate the size of these bush-like structures. They're several times thicker than the whole endothelial cell itself. And even if you consider now the importance of the membrane of the endothelium, so everything we know about clotting adhesion molecules or inflammatory adhesion molecules, all are positioned on the membrane of that endothelium, only a few nanometers thick. And then we have this glycocalyx bush-like structures of almost a micron thick, like 10 times to 100 times thicker than everything that we think is important happening on the vessel wall surface. And then to finish this part of the introduction, if you look at the cartoon of the vessel wall and the implications for the glycocalyx or for endothelial function. So on the left-hand side is a healthy vessel. Here if you have your endothelial cells again, your glycocalyx. And over the last couple of decades, so I started doing this in the late 1990s, we have realized, we and many others, that glycocalyx is key for any function of the endothelium that we know of. Now, these structures, they bend forward when blood flows, and the bending forward triggers your endothelial cells to produce nitric oxide, which is important for blood flow control. At the same time, these structures are highly negatively charged, and they bind all kinds of enzymes and proteins, also antioxidant enzymes like superoxide dismutase. So a healthy glycocalyx in a healthy vessel not only produces nitric oxide, but also scavenges oxygen radicals that are locally produced that might inactivate your nitric oxide. And the dense nature of those polysaccharides, like you saw in those bushes, they're all very close together. There are very small openings between the individual polysaccharides, much smaller than the size of individual proteins like albumin. So it prevents leakage of proteins, prevents leakage of larger molecules like cholesterol. It also prevents leakage of fluid and preventing edema. And as I mentioned before, on the membrane, you have your adhesion molecules for platelet adhesion or clot formation or inflammation. And these are very small, a few nanometers. So physically, the glycocalyx shields not only red cells from touching the wall, but also blood platelets and inflammatory cells, preventing blood clotting and inflammatory responses. And in not trying to talk too much, but if that's damaged by all kinds of risk factors like cholesterol or aging, the glycocalyx is damaged first, you start losing nitric oxide production, more oxidative stress, you lose proteins, you leak cholesterol, and you have all kinds of blood clotting issues and inflammatory issues. So hopefully that's a short introduction on why I think glycocalyx, what it is, and why I think it's very important for your cardiovascular health.
So what I love about this so much is this is such a comparison of, today's medicine versus the deeper picture, right? You go to your doctor, your blood pressure's high, they're smashing they're giving you a medication just to bring the blood pressure down, but it's really much more complicated than that at the microscopic level. And there's so much more dimension to what needs to be treated. This is more of an inflammatory autoimmune and again, glycocalyx health situation that is important. So why is this not part of mainstream medicine? Why aren't more doctors checking this? You guys have a lot of data that backs this up, that this is inherent to health of our cardiovascular system.
I can answer that first, and then Hans could weigh in. So you have to remember that Hans first got those images that he showed you 25 years ago, and that was totally in a research environment. And we've been on a quest the last 15 years together to educate the world about there is a glycocalyx, and then we had to prove what does it do. Why did God put it there in the first place? What's its physiological function? What does it control? And then more importantly, that's why we published all the studies, is how's it related to all of the, what I'll call early warning signs or conditions that develop, which then ultimately progress into diseases. And so we spent the last, Hans has been on this quest for how long, Hans?
I'm afraid to say, but I started doing this in mid-1980s. So you do the math. Huh?
Yeah, so quite a while. And then I joined you. We partnered up in early 2000, or back in, 15, 16 years ago. And so we first had to, I guess, prove the science and get all the information. And so now this is now just starting to come out. And so only in the last 5 years have people really started to talk about it. And where it's first been shared is mostly in what I'll call the regenerative or integrative medicine circles, because they tend to be more progressive. They're what I would call the early adopters. And so mainstream medicine are late adopters. And if you stop and think about it, this goes contrary. And even as we've published papers, we've dispelled myths that have been taught for, a long time. And now we're showing that what they thought was happening isn't really happening. And, when you publish these papers, especially when they're peer reviewed, sometimes you're dispelling the reviewer's actual scientific work. And so it takes a while for this kind of information to actually come to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit, because I thought this was fascinating as I learned your story, we've implemented this into the James Clinic. And so I've been doing a deep dive on your work for a while now, but you were in position in the ICUs around the world in hospitals when COVID hit. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And you were getting real-time data of what was going on with the Glycocalyx. How did COVID impact that? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that. And then we've got some actual data we can show you that. So right when COVID hit, Hans and I were actually at a conference in Brussels, and it was to launch a 5-year study. It was the first study that was going to look at the microvascular system and brain function and how it relates to cardiovascular function. And so as I was flying home from Amsterdam, I saw these people in the airport with masks. And I thought, wow, that's weird. So then we got home, and then COVID came to be. And then as soon as they started talking about what the symptoms were and what was happening to people, I knew immediately what was going on. And it's that the virus was attacking that glycocalyx that we just showed you. And so because we were already in over probably 150 or 180 academic research hospitals, we were in ICUs, we were doing a lot in the area of sepsis research, and this was starting to look a lot like sepsis. And so I reached out to a lot of the researchers we worked with and said, hey, I know you're getting filled up now with all these COVID patients. What would you think if we started looking at the COVID patients and compared what's happening to them with the data that we're getting with sepsis? And so that's how it kind of evolved. And then we did some long-term studies after COVID calmed down. And we actually, when COVID first came out, there weren't really any good solutions. There wasn't a vaccine yet. But we've been developed on, so what do you do about it products? And we even got an application that we started with the FDA for a nutraceutical because we knew we could restore the glycocalyx. And then when the vaccine came out, it kind of calmed everything down. Plus, if you remember at that time, and I think this is part of what you're talking about at the end when you go to your one website, is COVID was a nasty word. You couldn't talk about COVID. You couldn't tell people what you knew about COVID. Anything that you would say that might be the cause or the reason or share any information, you'd be blackballed from Facebook. You'd be blackballed from all kinds of places. So it was a very strange time in our history. But with that, I'll turn it over to Hans, and he can talk a little bit about what we learned.
Sure. Well, like Bob said, at the time that COVID hit, we were already in the ICU. And then at that time, people may not know, we had already developed a biomedical device called the GlycoCheck system, which is a small microscope instead of big microscopes in a laboratory setting, but a small handheld microscope, and we could measure actually non-invasively by putting the camera in people's mouth, and then look live at people's own microcirculation, and had software developed in that GlycoCheck system to measure how healthy your glycocalyx is and how healthy your microvasculature is. And we're doing a lot of study already in the ICU, and then suddenly all the ICUs were not shut down, but overcrowded with COVID patients instead of all the other patients. So in the middle of many studies, we could just switch to start looking into the COVID patients, which had some challenges, given the fact it was highly contagious, and you had to go in people's mouth and all that sort of stuff. But we were in a unique situation to do that. And knowing from other studies that we did with the GlycoCheck system that damage to your glycocalyx and an impaired microvascular health is a very good predictor of outcome. So people with a poor microvascular health and a damaged glycocalyx have a high chance of organ failure and not surviving their ICU stay. So that triggered us to do some of the studies. And whenever you are ready, Mollie, I can show you some of those data that we collected in the ICU. So let me share a few slides on those studies.
I think that would be great. And as you're pulling that up, I think this is relevant to people who had severe illness in the ICU, who have long COVID, post COVID, and even people who have COVID vaccine injury. The damage pattern is probably similar. I think that's
very similar. Also, and good for you to mention also the long haul COVID issues. So we did some of those patients that we measured at that time. We did also some 2 or 3 year follow-ups on patients that keep having issues, and turns out the damage that's being done by COVID to your glycocalyx and your microvascular health is very significant. And many people don't recover from that damage, even if the COVID itself was not very intense, the complications. Some people's microcirculation is completely wiped out. And even 2 years later, 3 years later, there's no obvious recovery from that damage. So they need some help improving the health of the microvasculature. So this is just a little tidying, showing that we did some stuff on COVID. Just a little introduction, going back to that endothelial cell function. And we know that a lot of the COVID-related issues are due to binding of the COVID spike protein to the endothelium. So, and there's receptors like the ACE2 receptor on the endothelium that the virus binds to and causes a lot of damage. So I spent some time talking to the researcher actually discovered ACE2. And one interesting discussion we had, the same as for the platelets sticking to their receptors and the inflammatory cells sticking to the receptors, before the spike protein can bind to its receptor on the endothelium, first it needs to pass glycocalyx. So people with already a compromised glycocalyx at risk of all kinds of cardiovascular damage were more at risk of all these COVID-related complications at the same time. So there's a big overlap between the risk profiles. And then, as you know, there's a lot of systemic binding of that COVID virus in different parts of your body. And I focus mostly on the vasculature and the heart. One thing we realized, in line with other studies that we did on increased risk for heart attacks and strokes, was that people that were infected with COVID, if you compare them with people without any cardiovascular risk, and you look over 3 years follow-up over time, and how many of these people get heart attacks and strokes, that after being exposed to COVID, their risk for getting a heart attack or a stroke increased about 6-fold. And even people that already had significant cardiovascular disease, if on top of that they got a COVID infection, their risk further increased about 2-fold. So there's a big impact on future cardiovascular issues after being exposed to COVID, very similar as what we've seen with glycocalyx damage. So this is just to illustrate the GlycoCheck system. So it's a small handheld video microscope that you put in your mouth and put it in the sublingual tissue, and a computer and software to automatically analyze the health of your microvasculature. And then you get live videos like this. So you put the camera in your mouth and you see all the red cells flowing through all many microvessels, and the software automatically looks at thousands of capillaries and has a algorithm that's patented to measure whether glycocalyx is still healthy and how many capillaries you still have. Because one of the things that we did realize in many studies that we did, if you compare the microvasculature of a healthy person, like on top, compared to the microvasculature of a person at risk of cardiovascular complications, even under resting conditions, in healthy individuals, more capillaries are blood perfused than patients at risk. So just counting the number of capillaries that have red cells flowing through them already tells you something whether a person is at risk for future cardiovascular complications. So one study that we did to illustrate that, before we go to the COVID part, this is all in healthy individuals. We measured in 400 healthy individuals in a study of diabetes and obesity. And based on the level of obesity and other risk factors like smoking or age, we made 3 subgroups, a low risk group, a medium risk group, of a high risk group, and then we counted the number of capillaries. So on this figure, the line 0 is a normal level of capillaries. And then from left to right are the smallest capillaries with diameters of 4 or 5 microns up to larger vessels of 10 microns, and showing that even healthy individuals exposed to risk, so they're not patients yet, already have a 30 to 50% drop in the numbers of smallest capillaries. So you start losing a lot of capillaries by exposure to risk. Now going into the ICU with the COVID patients on the right-hand side, so the red bars is capillary loss in COVID patients in the ICU that were on a mechanical ventilator, so they couldn't breathe by themselves. And the orange bars are COVID patients that could still breathe by themselves. And then comparing them to age-matched controls. So what this shows that these really sick COVID patients in the ICU, they lose up to 90% of their small capillaries. And these capillaries are critical to get nutrients into your organs and provide nutrients to all the cells in your organs. So if you lose up to 90% of your capillaries, it's virtually impossible to get food to all the cells in your organs, and your organs will be damaged and start to fail if this is not resolved in a matter of hours or days. And I'm just going to skip this. And this is just to illustrate the importance. This is a survival graph of COVID patients in the ICU. So we looked at COVID patients for up to 2 months, and then just based on their glycocalyx damage with the GlycoCheck system, we made 2 subgroups. So the blue line are relatively healthy patients with a minimal level of glycocalyx damage. So PBR is our parameter for glycocalyx damage. So when that value was below 2.3, they were considered relatively healthy. The red line are patients with a really damaged glycocalyx and compromised microvasculature. And these curves show survival over those 2 months' time. So you see, if their microvasculature and glycocalyx was in relatively good shape, all of these patients survived their stay in the ICU. With a compromised glycocalyx, the longer they stay in the ICU, see, even after they stay 1 month in the ICU, their chance of survival decreased to about 30 to 40%. And even longer, there are only 20% chance of survival if they stayed longer than 1 month in the ICU. So they really illustrated to us the importance of a healthy microvasculature and glycocalyx and what COVID can do to it and what impact it has on survival and risk of all kinds of complications in the ICU.
Yeah. And the reason I think this is important to mention is if there's somebody out there, I think there's still patients with spike-related issues, long COVID, vax injury, that probably haven't had a glycocalyx evaluation. They haven't had a GlycoCheck. It would be a reasonable thing to start with if they haven't added that into their plan at this point.
Yeah, so we always think measuring the health of your glycocalyx is important to know.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we know not everybody has access to clinics with GlycoCheck systems. So even more than just one thing to know how healthy your glycocalyx is, you can do things to improve the health of your glycocalyx and microvasculature, and you can start doing that before you know whether it's damaged or not, obviously.
Yeah. Yep. So I want to move on to, so that's the COVID stuff. I just thought that was so interesting. And since this group, originated there, I thought the audience would be interested in that. But let's move on to the things that compromise our glycocalyx that are not related to COVID. So what are the risk factors that we're looking at? Who should be out there thinking, I need to get a GlycoCheck, I need to have this evaluated to optimize my health, besides everyone?
Bob, you want to add something to that?
Sure. So, it's all the things that your doctor's been telling you for all these years. Your body mass index, how much you exercise, the air pollution, the air you breathe. Believe it or not, stress is a huge one. Stress has a massive impact on your glycocalyx. In fact, it's when I started tracking myself with an Aura ring a few years ago when they first came out. And then I started measuring my stress factor. So I could measure myself with the GlycoCheck. And if I was really stressed, my score would be lower. But if I would even just step aside and do some deep breathing exercises for 10 or 15 minutes and then come back and test, I could improve my glycocalyx score that fast. So the other things that you can think about, viruses, infections of all types are going to break down the glycocalyx. High glucose levels are going to break down the glycocalyx level. So what am I forgetting, Hans? What else?
Well, typically everything we know, all the risk factors that we know, high cholesterol, aging, families with premature atherosclerosis by genetic predisposition, lack of exercise, poor diet, everything that we know causes risk of cardiovascular disease. We know now that risk is actually induced by having an impact on the health of your glycocalyx first, and then endothelial dysfunction and clotting risk and inflammatory risk follows from that on.
So obvious ones would be smoking, vaping. I had a grandson that vaped, and I had tested him before, and it's like, dude, look what it's doing to you. And then, even drinking, I'm always amazed that people get these big gulp drinks and they sit and suck on them all day long. Think of the assault that's doing to their glycocalyx. It's under constant assault all day long.
Yeah. Yep. So we implemented this at James Clinic, and when I'm thinking about who's top of my list, right? Because yes, I would love to test everybody, but it's just probably not necessary for every single patient. But I'm thinking of patients who have renal issues, who have maybe cognitive issues. So if we're thinking about nutrient delivery to all of the cells, if we can open up if the capillaries are damaged and we can repair the capillaries, we can potentially improve the organ function, right?
Yep.
So cognitive issues, renal issues, erectile dysfunction, that's based on capillary function, right? So obviously
it's all about blood flow.
Yeah, it's all about blood flow. So those are the people I'm thinking of clinically when we talk about this. You guys have a great YouTube channel that I've enjoyed watching. So when we're thinking about that, can we improve renal function if we repair the glycocalyx?
Well, yeah, that was actually the answer is yes. The short answer to that important question. Actually, it was quite surprising to us to see in real clinical situations what can happen. So, just as a little bit of an introduction, a lot of our clinical studies actually started in renal disease. So the renal community was actually one of the first clinical communities that really embraced the importance of glycocalyx, which is quite surprising. I'm not sure how much people know about the special capillaries that we have in our kidneys. So kidneys have a special function, obviously. They need to filter our blood. So the capillaries in the kidneys are highly leaky, and a lot of fluid leaks over the wall of those capillaries, and then toxins are taken out, and most of the fluid gets back into the circulation. So to facilitate that filtration, the endothelium in those kidney capillaries is specialized. There are so-called fenestrated endothelial cells. They're big pores, big openings to allow fluid to go through. And those pore openings are like 10 times or 100 times bigger than proteins. So the endothelium was never considered an important barrier in preventing leakage of proteins. In early stage kidney disease, to detect kidney dysfunction, you measure how many proteins are leaked into your urine. So albumin increase in urine and your urine gets foamy. That's a sign that your kidney starts failing. Well, it took a while to realize that the endothelium in these kidney capillaries is highly fenestrated, big holes, but the holes are not open. They're all covered and filled with glycocalyx. And that actually prevents leakage of the protein. So you have a lot of fluid can be filtered, but the proteins stay inside the blood, and the glycocalyx keeps those kidney capillaries healthy. So now what happens if you are exposed to risk factors like smoking or aging or diabetes or high glucose levels, and you start damaging your glycocalyx in these kidney capillaries, then you start leaking those proteins. And once those proteins get outside the capillaries, they are interacting with cells that line your urinary space, podocytes. And these podocytes eat up the protein, they get sick, and that triggers damage to your capillaries. And you lose those capillaries, you lose kidney filtration capacity, and you start losing kidney function. So we knew that. We had a lot of studies showing glycocalyx damage is key in developing kidney loss of kidney filtration function. And then after meeting Bob and developing the glycocalyx therapeutics, based on the food-based compounds, realizing that those polysaccharides in glycocalyx are identical to some of the polysaccharides that we find in seaweeds. So then we started doing studies, also on patients and kidney patients, on what happens if you start repairing your glycocalyx. And not only could we stabilize the loss of kidney function, but we have many cases now of people with very poor kidney filtration functions, so GFR values, glomerular filtration rates of like 20 or 25 mils per minute, which is really, really poor and close to kidney transplant or dialysis. And to our surprise, we had quite a few people that over time, in a few months' time, the kidney functions improve to 60, 70, 80 mils per minute. So the lesson we are learning every day, not only in the kidney studies, is that, yeah, glycocalyx breakdown causes damage to your microvasculature, causes loss of function in many organs. But not only can we stabilize that, but by repairing your glycocalyx, your microvasculature adapts and recovers, and also you get gain of function in many organs. You can actually improve function in many organs that we thought were actually terminal and just going downhill, and you have to live with it. At some point, you lose your organ function. That turns not to be true. So you can actually repair your glycocalyx, improve microvascular function, and actually gain organ function again.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of early warning signs. You were asking what kind of people or who would be candidates or who should get tested. The crazy thing is I've probably tested more people glycocalyx than anybody in the world. And sometimes when I go to medical conference, I can test 50 or 60 people in a day. And a lot of those are health practitioners. And the thing I've come to realize is a person could look fairly healthy on the inside, but inside something totally different could go wrong. And the shocking thing to me now that I see is the number of people that have lost 50 to 70% of their true capillary function as far as their microvascular density. Then I'll ask them, well, did you have COVID? And they go, of course we did. I said, well, how many times did you have it? And someone will say, well, I had it 2 or 3 times. And I said, well, and then I can show them actually how many capillaries they've got that are able to deliver nutrients out to all the areas of the body. And so, this is probably maybe one of the most important things about people's health that they've never heard of, because it's at the core of pretty much every health condition you can think of. So, you look at women, in some women that you have hair thinning. Well, invariably, that's an early warning sign of microvascular dysfunction. You have neuropathy, you have ED, you have sexual dysfunction in women. There's all these early warning signs that your body's giving you, that it's like the early warning light in your car. It's flashing orange and it's going, hey, something's going on. And so that's what you need to look at, I think.
I just want to wrap on 2 questions that are straightforward and you've elicited or you've kind of mentioned. So how is the glycocalyx tested? For somebody who, I see a lot of questions in the chat. I think you made this clear. Dr. Vink, can you show again how we test this?
Yeah, I can go back to those slides, but basically what it comes down to, there's a small microscopic video camera that can actually live image how red cells are flowing through your capillaries. And then you count the number of capillaries, and in each capillary, like in that initial video that I showed you, you see the red cells flow in the center. They don't touch the wall, but there's a glycocalyx preventing them touching the wall. So we measure how deep the red cells can actually penetrate into that protective glycocalyx coating, how close they can get to the vessel wall. And we do that in many thousands of vessels. So we measure in each of the vessels how deep red cells can penetrate into glycocalyx as a measure for glycocalyx damage. And the consequence is when that happens, you start losing many of your capillaries. So we count the number of capillaries at the same time. So total capillary density or blood volume in your capillaries, the higher the better. And then glycocalyx damage as measured by how deep red cells can penetrate into glycocalyx. So the lower the damage, the better. And then we combine that in an overall microvascular health score. And then if people have more capillaries, the score is higher. If they have more glycocalyx damage, they have a low score. And then we correlate score with risk profiles.
So I can show you, this is what the camera actually looks like. So it's a high definition video microscope camera. And every time we put a sterile lens cover on it, and then it just goes in the mouth, under the tongue, right at the back. And then you actually see your own microvascular system. You see the actual capillaries with the individual red blood cells, kind of like that video that Hans showed you. So with our newest software, we can complete a test in about maybe 3 to 4 to 5 minutes, and then it takes about that long to calculate the score. So it's pretty quick.
Yep. And we do this in the office. We've been doing it now for 2 months, I think, a couple of months. We've had about 100 people come through and do it. Super easy. You get a report. It's very clear what the score is. So if we have not a great cardiovascular score, capillary health score, how do we fix it? Let's get into that, and then we'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Sure, I can maybe talk about that, because that's kind of what my quest was, because when I told you what happened to me, and so I got this idea when I heard about Glycocalyx. What if I could find the plants in nature that God created that if you took them would restore the Glycocalyx? And so that's actually what led me to Hans. I started reading all the papers because he was the first person that was publishing a lot of information about the Glycocalyx. And so, I learned about sulfated polysaccharides. And so I started looking, okay, where are the best sulfated polysaccharides? And then, this was 15, 16 years ago. So I was looking at different blue zones in the world. Where do people live longer? Why do they live longer? What did they do in their diet? So, one of the things that we found is certain types of seaweed have sulfated polysaccharides that are exactly like what the Glycocalyx is made up of. And so then we started experimenting with which extracts of those seaweeds would be the best and give us the highest or best outcome. And then we also looked at antioxidants for help support oxidative stress. So the first product I ever created in the marketplace was called Arterisol. It was named Arterisol because I thought we were dealing with the artery health problem. So I named it Arterisol because we were sealing the arteries, is what I thought. Then the next generation product was called Endocalyx. And then our most recent product is called Revasca, and it's our most advanced formula yet. And after COVID, we learned some important lessons. So we added some things that help immune function. So, for example, we added the inner leaf of the aloe vera plant, Ace mannan, for example. We have superoxide dismutase. We have catalase. We also have hyaluronic acid because hyaluronic acid absorbs a massive amount of its molecular weight in H2O, which is important because that Glycocalyx Hans was telling you about, it's those little sulfated, those little hairy things, those are sulfated polysaccharides. And then suspended in that is the gel matrix, and it's 98% water. So we experimented, and the lucky thing I had is I could partner with Hans, and we could do animal testing first, and then we could do human testing, and then we had the GlycoCheck. So we could get baseline scores on people and then see if we could improve their outcomes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That is fascinating. Kelly, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up. I see a lot of questions. I think we
There's
answered some of them.
a lot of questions. I might go back to a couple of the basics. Like, Dr. James, I'm wondering if you can talk about, it seems like this is something you're using in your practice now, is helping you better diagnose how to help people. So can you maybe just kind of summarize, where are you using this, where you may have used other kinds of biomarkers before? Because we're getting a lot of questions about this particular test and other heart biomarkers you might use to help diagnose issues and potential solutions.
Yeah. So prior to introducing this, we actually brought in an entire line of state-of-the-art testing into our practice. I call it functional testing. So before that, we just had labs. And we would use labs. We would use the InBody to give us a body impedance analysis, so body fat reports, things like that, anthropometrics, what's the hip to waist ratio. Those are the things you have. Continuous glucose monitor. So the Glycocalyx actually gives you a live look, or the GlycoCheck gives you a live look at the Glycocalyx. So we're comparing this with the MCG, the multifunction cardiogram, to give us, we've got the heart, we've got the blood vessels, we've got the brain gauge to tell us about the hardwiring of the brain. We've got the fibroscan to tell us about fatty liver. So we put that all together, and I've got a 3D representation on a patient, labs, and I have, function over time. So not just your traditional cardiac testing with an echo or with a coronary calcium score, but this is like the living framework of what's going on with the cardiovascular system. And you can view it with your eyes. It's really fascinating to watch your own, actually.
Well, the
Well, many
interesting,
doctors aren't approaching it in the same way that you are. So, and many in our audience are asking about things. If people are just getting cholesterol tests and blood pressure and those kinds of things, they're missing out on this 3D view that you're talking about. So, and we're also getting questions on this particular Glycocalyx test, and is it proprietary, and if people have access to that or not on different forms of insurance. So maybe you can help us with those 2 points.
I don't know about the insurance end of it, since we don't take insurance at our
Right.
office. It's a pretty simple test. We charge $375. You come in, you do the test, we give you the interpretation and the recommendations as far as when to do follow-up testing. So we're doing that about every 3 to 4 months if there's abnormalities. So yeah, that's how we're handling it.
currently the clinics that have GlycoCheck units throughout the country are in clinics like Mollie's, where they're really, I guess, regenerative or integrative medicine, and their patients are used to paying out of pocket. So this isn't currently covered by insurance. One of the things we've been looking at or working with the last year is to get this screening covered by Medicare. And so we've actually met with a lot of people in Washington, D.C., Make America Healthy Again. There's a big focus on this now. And Glycocalyx is right at the center of what we're talking about. And so we work a lot. We've done a lot of studies that have been funded by the VA, and different, different institutes. And what we find is that improving the Glycocalyx and having that assessment is an early canary in the coal mine. It's what you're going to be able to see is you're going to be able to find people that have a risk probably 10 or 15 years before it's ever going to result in a big event. And, people always are perplexed. He was so healthy. He ran, 10 miles a day. He was a marathon runner, but yet he drops dead with a heart attack. And so this is really one of the measures that tells you what's really happening at the vascular level. And that first slide that Hans showed you was the large artery. And up until now, all medical treatments have been focused on large arteries. And that's because that's what they could image, that's what they could treat. And if you stop and think about it, all treatments, pharmaceuticals, reduce the cholesterol, they reduce the glucose level, and then they thin the blood. But nobody's looked at or nobody's talking about what's happening with the capillaries and why are they shrinking? Why is that infrastructure dying? And then more importantly, how could we possibly restore that?
Well, if people, like, one on the website we've shared, does that list the different areas where people might be able to find a lab near them?
Yes, there's a finder on there. In fact, I've
Okay.
got to update it to,
Okay.
we're having several clinics add systems to their clinics each month right now.
Okay. And if they can't get access, they're not in an area, are there anything else that would help a trusted physician, identify issues in this particular area?
Yeah, well, one of the things that Mollie mentioned and that we work a lot with is a lot of people, it's normal practice, and clinics like Mollie's do really in-depth blood work. One of the guys I work really close with that's a good friend of mine is Dr. Jim Lavelle, and he's got the metabolic code. And so there's markers in your blood. They say your blood doesn't lie. There's markers in your blood, and some of those markers in your blood are also what's breaking down the glycocalyx. So what we do know is we can test and see what your glycocalyx health is. And we've developed therapeutics. We know that we can restore it. But then if we don't figure out why is it breaking down, you're kind of like a dog chasing your tail. I can fix it, but if you don't fix what's breaking it down, those risk factors, it's kind of like a vicious cycle.
I guess it's trying to help some of our followers if they don't have access to your kind of clinic or the kind of test. Are there other markers they could look at to work with their experts on to see the health of their glycocalyx?
Well, I'll let Hans talk about that, because a lot of the studies that we've done a lot of correlation to traditional markers that are in the blood, and then also traditional cardiovascular risk tools. So Hans, maybe you can talk about that just for a minute.
Yeah, so one study that relates best to that, Callie, is a study that we did on proteomics. So we measured almost random panel of 100 proteins in blood samples of patients, and then compared whether those proteins correlate with changes that we can measure with the GlycoCheck device, just number of capillaries and level of glycocalyx damage. And there are many proteins that we don't really know what the function is of these proteins. They do correlate positively or negatively with the GlycoCheck parameters. So actually we could define a protein signature that correlates strongly with the GlycoCheck system parameters. And then retrospectively, if you've got other studies, just look at the protein levels in patients that we didn't have GlycoChecks done. We can actually see very strong correlations with poor protein scores, or which actually correlate to poor GlycoCheck microvascular health scores and cardiovascular consequences. So, but those proteins are not standard panel for tests done in clinics. So, we have the paper also on our website if people are interested. So yeah, there is blood tests that can be done with a wide range of different proteins that do correlate with GlycoCheck parameters and glycocalyx damage. So that's one way to get some information if you're not able to do a GlycoCheck test.
Okay.
And that's one of the things we've really been focused on the last 16 years is we had to develop this education. And then, these blood tests Hans are talking about, those were studies we did in Europe. And interestingly enough, I've been shocked that Europe funds a lot of studies that we've done because of their socialized medicine model. They actually have a strong desire to keep people healthy versus the environment that we live in, whether it's maybe more incentivized for people to become sick, the sick health model. So it's a whole different philosophy, but that's part of what we're working on, to find some of those inexpensive blood markers that you could do that we know correlate, and that could be done by any clinic, for example.
Well, Dr. James, do you have any other recommendations for people if they don't have easy access?
They can take their Revasca just empirically. They can start taking a supplement to restore it, not knowing, just shoot blind. That would be the only other thing I would say, and just optimize what you can. I know we have patients traveling from all over the country to get the baseline testing. So, it's just what's your priority?
Right.
There were a couple of questions in here about doctors who want to get the system. I would go to their website and send them a message. It was really easy to incorporate for us. The training's simple. There's a little bit to the software setup, but our team's rocking and rolling with it, and it wasn't too bad. So
yeah, and we had easy financing, which made it easy to get it. And with
Yeah.
the model that you're using, it's easy to pay for it to be in the clinic to support your patients.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, we got a lot of questions as we kind of transition from that into, and when you know the health or the issues with your glycocalyx, how does that translate into tips of prevention and treatment? And you started talking about some of those areas. I know, Robert, you talked about just making sure you manage stress levels in other areas, but how do you, as a practitioner, Dr. James, advise people, once you get these scores on key actions that they can take?
Yeah, so getting your baseline assessment if you have problems, right, is the start. And then this Monday, I went over the cardiovascular training. So, implementing a walking program to continue to do things that are going to support the health of your system. Looking at your diet, controlling your blood sugar, stop smoking. All the things we know that harm the glycocalyx, do as many lifestyle things as you can, add the supplement where you need to repair it, and monitor it over time. It's a risk factor that's worth knowing, especially if you have a family history or a personal history.
I think Mollie made an important comment, and this is what I always tell people, is probably 95% of the people that buy our products have never had a GlycoCheck test. Once they go on our site and learn about the science and understand how and why what we've developed works, then basically what happens is they start taking it. This is one of the products that you actually feel. People actually, they have better hair, they have better skin. One of the first things that we noticed, which was striking, is there's a lot of people that have hypertensive issues, especially as we age. And there's even people that, take 3 different types of meds and they still have uncontrolled hypertension to a good level. One of the first things that we notice is when we restore that glycocalyx and we restore that natural production of nitric oxide and the vasodilation, we actually are getting the body to heal itself. And that's the best way, in my opinion, to improve your health, is to get your body to do what it desperately wants to do. And that's to heal itself rather than masking it and trying to fake it out by taking other products that are only masking the root cause.
Well, you had mentioned that, people might be prescribed statins, like traditional, like we don't know exactly what's going on with you, so we're going to prescribe these solutions. And we've seen a lot of comments in the chat and just questions that we get into our support at IMA about statins being overprescribed. Can you give your perspective on that, Dr. James, and then how some of these markers might help with that?
Yes. So first of all, if someone's prescribing a statin to you that doesn't do an advanced lipid panel run, you should have an advanced lipid panel. They're $40 through LabCorp. It's not massively expensive. It's a fasting blood test. It gives you the LDL particle number, the particle size. That's what you need to be basing it on. So the total cholesterol concentration is not the risk factor. It's other things. So also, I will add that the majority of people who have a lipid issue, when I optimize their thyroid, the lipid issue goes away. The majority, not 100%. So I'm looking to optimize diet first, thyroid second, and third, I'm looking at statins or genetic things or liver issues or other issues. And I may use a low dose statin in those patients if they have a persistent LDLP that's elevated with a small size, putting them at increased risk. So that's just my perspective, how I do it clinically.
I'd say, Hans, maybe if you could pull up and share your screen. We actually did a study. You did a study early on with cholesterol. And the bottom line is if you have a thick, healthy glycocalyx, if you can pull up, we can show you 2 pictures. Will answer this question once and for all, because a picture's worth 1,000 words. But essentially, if you have a thick glycocalyx, cholesterol doesn't go through and it can't get underneath the endothelial cell and do the damage that it's doing. And so, a lot of people take statins. I personally, my doctor's always on me. He always wants me to take a statin. I tried them once and I didn't like the way they made me feel. I felt like I had kind of the flu a little bit all the time. And so, I'm insured by United Healthcare. I get their nurse that calls me once a year, and they always try to twist my arm into taking statins. And I'm just going, hey, you know what? I've tested myself with the GlycoCheck and I've got a super thick glycocalyx. So I'm looking at the tree from a different angle. And I know as long as I've got a thick glycocalyx, it can't get through. So Go ahead, Hans.
Well, just to illustrate what Bob was saying, one of the studies that we did early on is looking at atherosclerosis in large arteries where cholesterol can leak into the wall and causes lesions to form. If you look in large vessels where that happens, the sites where cholesterol start leaking typically are sites with a very thin glycocalyx. So you see a very thin glycocalyx at these sites where cholesterol leaks, and then downstream in the same vessel, or even on the other side of the vessel wall, there's a very thick glycocalyx. So because of the location, there's a thinner glycocalyx at these sites. But if you look at cholesterol leakage, so this is looking at sites with a thick glycocalyx on the left and a thin glycocalyx on the right. And the green labeled molecules are cholesterol molecules. And on top is the black is where blood is flowing. The blue is the vessel wall with the endothelium. So on the left, if your vessels have a thick glycocalyx in a healthy individual, all the cholesterol gets stuck in glycocalyx. It doesn't leak across the glycocalyx. It doesn't enter your blood vessels. And only at sites where they're very thin glycocalyx, then within minutes, you see a lot of the green dye leaks between the endothelium, starts accumulating in the vessel wall, causing cholesterol accumulation, triggering an inflammatory response and the downstream inflammation and atherosclerosis. So the bottom line is cholesterol is a huge molecule, much bigger than albumin. And as long as your glycocalyx is healthy, cholesterol hardly leaks over your endothelium and it dramatically lowers your risk of atherosclerosis. So yeah, in our biased perspective, cholesterol itself is not the bad agent causing all these
You need
issues.
to go deeper, it sounds like, and get these other perspectives.
If you keep your vascular system in good shape, then you can handle some fluctuations in your cholesterol levels.
Well, I know, Dr. Vink, it's been really helpful for people to see some of the visuals you pulled up. So we'll want to make sure that we can get some of the slides that you've shown in tonight's webinar, so we can post them along with the video tomorrow. A couple questions, and we're kind of hitting our timeline here, but some people asked, okay, so you presented some issues when you were talking about some of the studies with COVID during that time. Does everyone that had COVID or the vaccine need to worry that they may have damage in this area? Could you speak to that?
No, obviously we didn't follow up everybody. We do know that people that were exposed to COVID, they all show damage to the microvasculature, and many of them have issues recovering from that. So the people that we did follow-ups over 2-3 years were all people complaining of long haul COVID issues, and these people needed support to help them recover from the microvascular damage. But the good thing is, we also did a clinical trial on people exposed to COVID. We did 4 months of follow-up, giving them either a placebo or the Glycocalyx therapeutic Brevasca. And we saw significant improvement of their microvascular health, but also larger vessels become less stiff, which is a good thing. Their heart blood flow, the coronary flow reserve improved. Their circulating levels of oxidative stress molecules were significantly reduced. So there's a lot of things that we can do to help people exposed to COVID, whether they have complaints or not. We all see significant improvement of microvascular health, but also large vessel elasticity and heart function.
And did your testing distinguish between people that got COVID and people that had those symptoms as a result of the vaccine?
No, we didn't differentiate between that. The thing is, even people that did not really get sick, but still exposed to the virus, can have significant microvascular damage for a long time following that exposure.
Yeah, we did have questions about if shedding could have been an impact that created damage. There's a line of questions. I'm trying to jump between all these.
Yeah, it's difficult to say what's happening because of what. So we think in our logic, if you have a poor glycocalyx, it's easier for the COVID virus to bind to your vessel wall. But as soon as it binds and it triggers endothelial activation, a lot of glycocalyx is shed, and you expose the rest of your vascular system, and you're very prone to clotting disorders, inflammatory consequences. So yes, that might very well be possible.
So Dr. James, I got another question here. I think it might help people. If we can give people the exact LabCorp test, if they're concerned on these issues that you mentioned, could you repeat those again for us?
Yes, there's two main ones. There's an advanced lipid panel, or there's an NMR lipoprofile. They give slightly different information, but there's some overlap on those two. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I feel like this is a very deep topic that we're only able to scratch the surface with. And obviously, finding out different ways to diagnose issues and really getting to the core is critical to get the right kind of treatment and resolution. Dr. James or Vink or Lung, any other things that you would like to mention before we wrap and go to our closing comments tonight?
Yeah, I would just say if people really want to do a deep dive, if you go to our YouTube channel, Glycocalyx Research Institute,
Mhm.
we have a whole series of YouTube or videos. So last year we did a whole series on heart health. We did one on kidneys. We did one on, the differences between men and women. Why do women have different heart attacks and men do? We did one on kidney health. We did one on hypertension. And we also did one on kidney health. And we had actual people that we had actually helped get off of dialysis. And also we had one person we'd been treating for 15 years. He was on dialysis and because he had a kidney transplant that failed. And then his story, by putting him on the product, he actually got his vascular system so healthy, the VA paid for a new kidney transplant for him over a year and a half ago, which is unheard of. And so he was able to get off of dialysis, and it's totally changed his lifestyle. So he was able to be on dialysis at that point for 13 years. The average life expectancy for a dialysis patients is about 6 or 7 years. So it's this is a very deep topic, and we'd be happy to come back and go into more in-depth topics if you'd like us to in the future.
It sounds like you've got some great educational resources on prevention too that are
Yeah, we
listed on
do.
the YouTube channel. So we'll make sure to grab that as well from you. So when we post a summary of this webinar tonight, we can easily connect people to those resources.
All right, sounds great.
Okay. Okay, Dr. James, anything else in closing?
No, I just want to thank Bob and Dr. Vink for being here. This has been transformational in our practice just in a short time we've implemented it. It gets to the root cause and really finding out what the risk factors are and treating at the root. So it's all about what I believe and I think what patients are looking for more and more.
Well, thank you all
Thank you,
for
Mollie.
joining
Thank
us
you, Kelly.
tonight.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
All right, I'll go into some of our business. I know we're running late, so I'll go through this fairly quickly. But one, we wanted to talk a little bit about our upcoming conference. Most people are aware that we've got our conference happening April 17th and 18th in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And Livia's going to be pulling at the slide for me here too, but it's our emerging trends in medicine. And the end of this week, our early bird pricing expires. So please go ahead and look to get tickets now at imahealth.org/conference. And we are providing CMEs, continuing educational credits for folks, and you get almost 13 credits. So check that out today. And then we have a new paper being published, Running on Empty When Patients Stay Exhausted. And we did a great infographic that we shared on social media and an article that we've shared out on our Substack channel. But Dr. Verone and our research director, Dr. Matt Halma, put together a great new topic and research you might want to go through that talks about what is causing this exhaustion and what are the chronic issues that can be addressed. And then for next week's webinar, we've got Dare to be a Daniel. And it's really about leading with principle where it matters most. We're going to be talking about ethics in the hospital with Dr. Verone, Dr. Cole, and Chris Akram, who is a healthcare executive and shares our philosophy, but also manage the administration of many hospitals. So it should be a great discussion next week. And then we've got a new link for those that are struggling with chronic symptoms. We wanted to make sure you're aware of a new traditional Chinese medicine guide that we've worked on with Dr. Christina Carmen. And this builds on the webinar that we had a couple weeks ago with her and Dr. Adil Verone on these particular areas of treatment. So something you might want to check out. We've got the URL and the link on the screen here for you. And then as of today, one thing we wanted to share is a new resolution, the COVID Justice Resolution. And many of you, I think, would agree that we want to make sure that the injustices that were happening during COVID do not go unnoticed, and there's not quiet, and there's a need for transformation on that. IMA is joined with other trusted partners who initiated the COVID Justice Resolution. This was inspired by an article Jeffrey Tucker at Brownstone Institute created, and many of our very trusted partners, Brownstone, of course, Children's Health Defense Fund, Health Freedom Defense Fund, Stand for Health Freedom, and Autism Action Network are also involved. And at the link here, covidjustice.org, you can go ahead and review this resolution yourself and see if it's something you agree to and sign your name. This is something we'd like to get some energy beyond, because we want to make sure we're driving awareness to things that we don't want to ever happen again in the future. So check that out and pass it along if you can. And to go ahead and set up our closing video, we just want to thank you all tonight. And we'll go ahead and make sure that we talk about the different opportunities for the Journal of Independent Medicine is looking for more and more papers. So we're going to show you a quick video and make sure that you submit them to Independent Medicine's Journal of Independent Medicine. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Dr. Joseph Varon, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Independent Medicine. And this is our second year in circulation. As you can see, the Journal of Independent Medicine continues to grow. We are getting more indexing in several important databases. And now is a good time to call for papers. If you have a good paper, good data, send it to us. We really would love to publish data from independent researchers, especially in those areas that you think would be banned or would be closed by other journals. As long as you have good data, the data is scientifically sound, you will have an absolutely fair evaluation, and we will help you get that paper out. Learn more at Journal of Independent Medicine. You will have our submissions instructions and our submission requirements, very simple, and you will have no issues submitting your papers.